The Grove of Endless Night. The forest was older than time itself. Locals called it the Blackwood, a sprawling expanse of gnarled trees and twisted undergrowth that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. But deep within its heart lay a place no one dared to speak of, a place known only as the Grove of Endless Night. It was said that once you entered the grove, you never left. Not truly. The arrival. Ellie had always been drawn to the unknown. As a child, she'd spent hours poring over maps of forgotten places, her imagination ignited by tales of hidden worlds and ancient secrets. Now, at 27, she was a freelance journalist chasing stories that others were too afraid to touch. When she heard whispers of the Grove of Endless Night, she knew she had to see it for herself. The journey to the Blackwood was long and arduous. The road narrowed to a dirt path, then to little more than a deer trail winding through the dense trees. The air grew colder with every step, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin, sickly strands. Ellie's GPS had stopped working miles back, and her phone had no signal. She was utterly alone. By the time she reached the edge of the grove, the sun was setting. The trees here were unlike any she'd ever seen, tall and skeletal, their bark blackened as if scorched by some long-forgotten fire. The ground was carpeted in a thick layer of ash, and the air smelled faintly of decay. At the center of the grove stood a circle of ancient oaks, their branches intertwined to form a canopy so dense that no light could penetrate. This was it, the Grove of Endless Night. Ellie hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but the journalist in her pushed her forward. She stepped into the circle of trees, and the world changed. The darkness. The moment Ellie crossed the threshold, the grove came alive. The air grew heavy and oppressive, and the faint whispers she'd heard since entering the forest grew louder, more insistent. They weren't words, exactly, more like fragments of thoughts, half-formed and dripping with malice. She couldn't tell if they were coming from the trees or from inside her own mind. The darkness was absolute. Ellie fumbled for her flashlight, but the beam barely pierced the gloom. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted roots snaking across the ground like grasping fingers. She stumbled forward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Stay! Join us! You belong here." Ellie shook her head, trying to clear the voices from her mind. She had to focus. She had to find a way out. But the grove seemed to stretch on forever, the trees shifting and rearranging themselves to block her path. She was trapped. The shadows. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had no meaning in the grove. Ellie's flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into total darkness. She pressed on, her hands outstretched to feel her way through the trees. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. And then she saw them. Shadows moved among the trees, darker than the surrounding night. They were shapeless at first, but as they drew closer, they began to take form, humanoid figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They reached for her, their fingers long and skeletal. Ellie screamed and ran, but the shadows were everywhere, closing in from all sides. She tripped over a root and fell, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. The shadows loomed over her, their whispers now a deafening roar. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end. But it didn't come. When she opened her eyes, the shadows were gone. The grove was silent, the whispers reduced to a faint, almost imperceptible hum. Ellie scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. She had to get out of here. She had to. A voice stopped her in her tracks. "Ellie." It was soft, almost tender. A voice she hadn't heard in years. Her mother's voice. Ellie turned, her breath catching in her throat. Standing a few feet away was a figure, a woman with long, dark hair and a gentle smile. It was her mother, exactly as she remembered her from before the accident. "Mom?" Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. The woman nodded. "I've been waiting for you, Ellie. I've missed you so much." Ellie took a step forward, tears streaming down her face. It had been 10 years since her mother's death, 10 years of longing and regret. She wanted nothing more than to run into her arms, to feel her warmth again. But something held her back. A tiny voice in the back of her mind, warning her that this wasn't real, that it couldn't be real. "Ellie," her mother said again, her voice tinged with sadness. "Don't you want to be with me?" Ellie hesitated. The grove seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. The choice. The shadows returned, swirling around the edges of her vision. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Ellie's mother reached out a hand, her eyes pleading. "Stay with me, Ellie. Please." Ellie took a deep breath, her heart breaking. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to believe that this was real, that she could be with her mother again. But she knew the truth. This wasn't her mother. This was the grove, feeding on her grief, her longing. "No," she whispered. Her mother's face twisted in anger, her features melting away to reveal the hollow-eyed shadow beneath. The grove erupted in a cacophony of screams and howls, the shadows surging forward to claim her. Ellie turned and ran, her legs pumping as she fought her way through the trees. The shadows clawed at her, their whispers now a deafening roar. She could feel them pulling at her, trying to drag her back into the darkness. And then she saw it, a faint glimmer of light ahead. The edge of the grove. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. The light grew brighter, closer. With one final burst of strength, Ellie broke free of the trees and stumbled into the open air. The sun was rising, its golden light spilling over the forest. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The grove was silent. The return. Ellie didn't know how long she sat there, trembling and crying. When she finally found the strength to stand, she turned to look back at the grove. The trees stood as they always had, dark and foreboding. But there was something different about them now. Something watchful. She knew she had escaped, but she also knew that the grove hadn't let her go. Not entirely. She could still feel it, a cold, heavy presence in the back of her mind. The whispers were faint now, but they were still there, a constant reminder of what she had faced. Ellie turned and walked away, her steps slow and unsteady. She didn't look back. The ending. Years passed, and Ellie tried to move on with her life. She wrote about her experience in the grove, but no one believed her. They called it a hoax, a desperate attempt to gain fame. Eventually, she stopped talking about it altogether. But the grove never left her. The whispers grew louder at night, and she often woke to find shadows moving in the corners of her room. She tried to ignore them, to convince herself that it was all in her head. But deep down, she knew the truth. The grove was waiting. One night, as she lay in bed, the whispers became unbearable. They filled her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. She tried to fight them, but it was no use. The grove was too strong. Ellie rose from her bed and walked to the window. Outside, the trees swayed in the moonlight, their branches reaching out to her like skeletal hands. She opened the window and stepped outside, her bare feet sinking into the cold, damp earth. The shadows were waiting for her. They surrounded her, their hollow eyes glowing with a faint, malevolent light. Ellie didn't resist as they led her into the forest, back to the grove. She was home,